What is the Bible? Class 41, Brothers Reconciled. And boy, has it been a long time coming. We will be covering Genesis chapter 44 through 45, verse 8. And I know last week I said verse 15, 45, 15, but as I studied throughout the course of this week, I decided that the end of verse 8 would be a better stopping point, and we will pick up right there next week. And we'll just dive right in with the text. Genesis chapter 44 begins. Then he commanded the steward of his house, fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money on the top of his sack. Put my cup, the silver cup, in the top of the sack of the youngest, with his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. As soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away with their donkeys. When they had gone only a short distance from the city, Joseph said to his steward, "Go, follow after the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why have you returned evil for good? Why have you stolen my silver cup? Is it not from this that my Lord drinks? Does he not indeed use it for divination? You have done wrong in doing this.'" This comes, of course, just after Joseph has shared a sumptuous feast with his 12 brothers, where he sat them in birth order and gave his full brother Benjamin, I think 5 times the portion of food straight from his own table, nonetheless. But so this is a real turn of events where they were receiving favor, and now they're under the crosshairs of Joseph yet again and on the hot seat. This is one more test, and this one with Benjamin as the test's focus. He is implicated by design of a scandalous crime, although the brothers don't know it yet. And Joseph has singled out his father's favored son. A few words about this cup that we're talking about. Joseph uses the cup to divine, that is, to seek the meaning of events through observing patterns in the liquid. You might compare it to the modern use of tea leaves or coffee grounds. God could work through such means, which is linked with Joseph's ability as a dream interpreter. It may be that Joseph does not actually practice divination, although he claims to in verse 15, but he certainly wants his brothers to think that he does. They must have had an increasing sense of being hemmed in at the mercy of powers beyond their control, writes Fritham. Divination, a few words. This type of practice seems entirely acceptable when practiced by Joseph as alluded to in verse 15, which we'll get to in a second, and others in Genesis, as is the case with Laban in Genesis chapter 30, 27, who is able to discern that his nephew is about to leave, ironically Jacob in that story. Yet it is condemned elsewhere in the Bible. For example, in Deuteronomy 18, verse 10, which outright condemns the practice. But here within the world of Genesis, there doesn't seem to be any issue, especially as it relates to Joseph doing it. Verse 6, then he being the servant, the steward, overtook them. He repeated these words to them. They said to him, "Why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants that they should do such a thing. Look, the money that we found at the top of our sacks, we brought back to you from the land of Canaan. Why then would we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? Should it be found with any one of your servants, let him die. Moreover, the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves." I'll pause to note that you get from these sentences, these disclaimers, that they really do not believe that they would never have put their lives on the line if they thought for 1 second that they possessed the money that they had brought in exchange for the grain or Joseph's cup. So they're proclaiming their innocence, and they seem to really believe it. And why shouldn't they? After all, it makes no sense. They did bring back the money the first time, and why would they try to secret it away? And what good would it be to steal Pharaoh's cup? Either way, they put their own lives on the line as collateral. Picking up with verse 10, he said, he being the steward, "Even so, in accordance with your words, let it be. He with whom it is found shall become my slave, but the rest of you shall go free." Then each one quickly lowered his sack to the ground, and each opened his sack. He searched, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. At this, they tore their clothes. Then each one loaded his donkey, and they returned to the city. The brothers' vow echoes Jacob's vow when Rachel stole Laban's family gods. You may remember that he too proclaims loudly his innocence. And from his vantage point, he had no idea that Rachel had stolen the family gods. And so he makes similar proclamations. And so we're to get these ironic echoes in the story of Jacob's story and now his son's story, who are making similar claims. They are similarly unaware that one of them, Rachel's son, again, another level of irony, has the missing item. The steward lightens their vow to slavery for the one with whom it is found. Note that this description doesn't say that he stole the cup, merely that it is in his possession. Note that the steward is the one who put it there, handled chapter 72. The search echoes the meal that they had just shared with Pharaoh, where the brothers were arranged in birth order, back in chapter 43, verse 33, as we covered last week. The suspense builds as the search progresses, and more so for us, because we know that when the buck stops with Benjamin, that he is going to be caught seemingly red-handed. And then note that they tore their clothes. Handel writes, their response to the discovery of the cup and the imminent loss of Benjamin directly echoes Jacob's response to the loss of Joseph. So they rend their clothing as their father had done at the news that Joseph had been lost. This is a gesture of mourning. Their grief is poetic justice for the grief they caused their father. And we see a lot of this in this story, where the brothers experience many of the same feelings, emotions, and experiences as did Joseph and their father. And so they are, in a way, as Handel notes, in a way by way of poetic justice, paying for their sins. Verse 14. Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house while he was still there, and they fell to the ground before him. Joseph said to them, "What deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that one such as I can practice divination?" And Judah said, "What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? How can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Here we are then, my Lord's slaves, both we and also the one in whose possession the cup has been found." But he said, "Far be it from me that I should do so. Only the one in whose possession the cup was found shall be my slave. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." Now, verse 15, Jacob claims to be able to practice divination, and whether or not he does so is really beside the point here, because he doesn't need to practice divination to know what is really going on. But by claiming divination as an ability, he offers an explanation to his brothers for his near omniscient grasp on their situation, his knowledge of their birth order, for instance, and he just always seems to be several steps ahead of the brothers and able to string them along. And I guess divination is offered as an excuse or a reason, which we know that the real reason he is able to have such keen insight into their lives is the fact that he recognizes them and is indeed their half brother, and in the case of Benjamin, their full brother. Fritham writes, Judah, the spokesman for the brothers, acknowledges that they are entirely at Joseph's disposal. They can do nothing to clear themselves. Although he never confesses that a crime has been committed, Judah makes a public confession of guilt for all the brothers and throws them on the mercy of this Lord. For him to include all the brothers suggests that he has more than this event in mind, including their actions against Joseph. And you can recall back in chapter 42 how this reality was named, that they believed that these events were transpiring by some way of divine judgment because of what they had done to Joseph way back when. And here he seems to be believing that, and this is evidenced by the fact that he proclaims guilt on all of the brothers, guilt on your servants, all of them. Though Joseph does not recognize this dynamic. So Joseph not allowing Judah to throw them all under the bus, so to speak. Joseph refuses to make all of his brothers slaves, only the one in whose bag the cup was found. Fritham writes, on the surface, this proposal appears magnanimous, but Joseph knows that they cannot return to their father without Benjamin. Joseph has tightened the screws. How will his brothers respond? The brothers that we met back in Genesis chapter 37 would no doubt have cut their losses and have invented a story to their father to explain his favored son's absence, such as the story that they told about Joseph being attacked by wild animals and treading that fantastic coat and covering it with animal's blood. Maybe some similar rules would have been in order if they had not changed over the years. But here they're not going to abandon their younger brother in Egypt and invent some story to get themselves off the hook. Instead, Judah lapses into a long speech, which we will read in total, and then I'll offer some commentary from one sole source from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, because I really feel that what Fritham writes there summarizes the speech quite well without really me needing to add anything. Verse 18, then Judah stepped up to him and said, "Oh, my Lord, let your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears, and do not be angry with your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? And we said to the Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a young brother, the child of his old age. His brother is dead. He alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me so that I may set my eyes on him. We said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. Then you said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall see my face no more. Then we went back to your servant, my father. We told him the words of my Lord. And when our father said, go again, buy us a little food, we said, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother goes with us will we go down, for we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have never seen him since. If you take this one also from me, and harm comes to him, you will bring down my gray hairs in sorrow to Sheol. Now, therefore, when I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became surety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame in the sight of my father all my life. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord in place of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the suffering that would come upon my father. And in case you got lost in all of this my servant talk, he refers to his father, Jacob, as Joseph's servant and himself as Joseph's servant. And basically, he summarizes what we already know, that Jacob was more than reticent to send Benjamin down into Egypt, but had to because of Joseph's insistence. And Judah had offered up himself as collateral should he not be able to bring Benjamin back safely. And now we see Judah making good on this promise, saying, let me stay. I will stay. And you just please send my brother back, or else our father will die. Will die for his sorrow. So we see, again, more evidence of the change in these brothers. Fritham writes, and I'm going to read at length, and instead of typing it out, I just took some screenshots of this passage about this speech. Because what I miss in its translation is that it is one of the most well-constructed and most beautiful and poetic speeches in the Old Testament. Something, I've read it several times. I don't have a scholar's eye, and I don't know how to read Hebrew. So with that in mind, this is what Fritham writes about it. Judah responds with a passionate speech, the longest in Genesis, and a literary masterpiece, not least in the way it gathers up the story to this point, in a way similar in its rhetorical power to his speech to Jacob in 43, 3 through 10. Judah seeks to persuade Joseph to keep him rather than Benjamin. To this end, Judah makes selective and expansive use of previous conversations with Joseph himself, and several instances of this are quoted. and with Jacob. Now, I underline this next part because this is something that I never noticed until I was studying for this lesson. Joseph hears for the first time his father's reaction to his own abduction, and that Jacob still mourns for him. Judah speaks straightforwardly and sincerely, conveying what is at stake for his family in quite direct ways. At the same time, he speaks in a highly deferential manner. In initial approach, you are like Pharaoh himself, and in general language, Lord, servant, which that combination of words or one variant, Lord or servant, is used 20 times. And in omitting any harshness from prior conversations, Joseph's charge of spying and threat of death. The speech also has strong emotional content, especially regarding the negative effect on their aged father, mentioned 14 times, whose life has been so filled with hardship and loss. Judah stresses that this is a matter of life and death for him. He also recalls the violence done to Joseph and refers to Jacob's special love for Benjamin, with whom his life is bound up. Judah speaks of this in non-judgmental ways, recognizing and accepting such preferential treatment by his father. The climax of the speech refers to the suffering of their father. Their suffering their father will endure, a contrast to the brothers' concern in 37, 31 through 35, which, if you recall, the concern was all about the consequences the brothers would face. Now their fear is the consequences that their father will face in spite of his favoritism. Fritham goes on. Judah also underscores the extent to which the brothers have acceded to Joseph's requests. Even more, how he has placed his own future on the line. This makes clear that he is following through on his promise to his father. Judah's speech accents his integrity and gives further evidence of a change in the brothers. Judah's willingness to also appears ironic, for he would then become the slave of the very one he had made a slave. It all comes full circle. Now we will move into chapter 45, and as I said, we'll conclude with verse 8. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." This marks the 3rd time that Joseph has wept for his brothers. The first time he wept for his half-siblings, the second time at his reunion with Benjamin. Now he weeps for his reunion with all of them. The first 2 times he wept, he did so in such a way that he was able to keep the secret. Not so this time. Fritham writes, Joseph weeps so loudly that it proves not to be a private affair after all. Respect for previous generations was a core value of ancient Near Eastern society. Moved by Judah's description of Jacob's plight, Joseph could no longer keep his secret, but emptied the room of Egyptians and said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The siblings were dumbfounded. In fact, they are shocked to silence. Handel writes, the brothers' dismay is compounded by fear for their lives, since Joseph is in a position to exact justice for their crime. As an aside, you may have noticed that Joseph revealed his identity twice. This is thought to be perhaps an editorial amalgam of the sources, the E source and the J source. I just thought I'd point that out, just as a reminder that these stories come to us as a compilation of various sources. So in verse 3, Joseph says, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" And then in verse 4, he said, "Come closer. I am your brother Joseph." Just that's neither here nor there. And here's our now has become a weekly occurrence, our Lego picture. Handel writes, "In the moment of resolution, Lucian, Joseph shows his wisdom, compassion, and insight into God's plan, interpreting for the brothers the meaning of their mutual history. Events have a double agency, with God's plan containing and guiding human intentions. The brothers sold Joseph in Egypt, but God sent him before them with the divine plan to preserve life. God sent me before you is repeated 3 times in verses 5 through 8, with identical wording in verses 5 and 7. Highlights these repetitions highlight divine agency behind events. By his interpretive gifts, Joseph reestablishes peace among the brothers. And Ron Allen and Clark Williamson, in the book that they co-wrote together, write, Joseph recalled the wrongful act of which the siblings were guilty. They stand accused, yet in the next sentence, Joseph offered a pastoral word as a theological interpretation of what had happened among them. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Emphasis, ours. According to the theologians who shaped this narrative, God used the events of Genesis 37 through 44 to prepare provisions through Joseph in Egypt for the family during the famine. Readers in later generations could thus have confidence that the sovereign God of Israel could ultimately work through any circumstance for blessing. Some closing thoughts. Some commentators believe that Joseph turns the test into an insolent, almost wanton game. And one commentator is a man named Bon Rad in his commentary on Genesis. This seems unlikely. As noted, testing must involve action and not just words. Whether there has been a change in fact can more readily be discerned by the way people act. Moreover, the testing gives the brothers an experience not unlike Joseph's own, as in chapter 42. This mirroring process enables the brothers to recognize their guilt and makes reconciliation possible. And I add, that was a quote from Frightham, I add, sometimes you have to walk in another's shoes to gain in life experience to understand how our actions have impacted others. Joseph's brothers were put through the what they had done to Joseph, which is why they keep bringing it up throughout the course of the story. This is because of what we did to Joseph. That comes up a couple of times. The dominant theological theme of the story is this, and this has been brought up several times throughout the course of these lessons. And Joseph even names it as a reality several times too. God will work through our circumstances for the good. Because this is so, we can make meaning of our trials in the meantime and acknowledge the ways God turns what is intended for evil into positive outcomes. Allen and Williamson write, one function of this text is to assure readers that God can work for good through any circumstance, no matter how bitter. However, the preacher needs to handle this claim with care. It is theologically inconsistent with the affirmation that God is unconditionally loving to think that God would directly cause events that brought such pain to Joseph, Jacob, and the siblings, even in the name of long-term good. Because God is omnipresent, trying to help each event in life reach the highest potential available, the community can affirm that God is ever at work in events such as those in Genesis 37 through 44. God tries to help every event achieve as much blessing as possible. When good does result from difficulty, we can give thanks for the good without thinking that God orchestrated the difficulties. And next week, we'll be covering Genesis chapter 45, picking up at verse 9 where we left off, and then concluding with Genesis chapter 46, which we will go over in its entirety, but we will not read in its entirety as it has some genealogy lists and things that might be difficult to suss through if we go through every single word. And here are my sources. And I'll bring us back.
Well, I'll pick up on that last statement that you had on the difficulties. Over the years, I think I've learned with these difficulties that come into each and every life they're only there for us to learn from and to give God the glory for getting us through it. And so God has his plans and his reasons for doing things, and our job is to work through them with his grace and then give him the glory for bringing us through.
What I like about this story is how you can hold the blame that the brothers deserve for things that they should not have done in tension with this, not even in tension with, but with this acknowledgement that in spite of those things that the brothers should not have done, these things that happened to Joseph that were unjust, with the reality that God took what, as Joseph put it, what was intended for evil and turned it on its head for the good. I'm reminded of the book of Job, where things befall upon Job that God was not the direct cause for, but the learning and the gaining and wisdom in the face of it was what transformed Job, and which makes it such a powerful book. And so you might be sitting next to somebody who is sick and dying, and you can say, I don't believe this, but you have this disease, and what is God going to do to call the best possible outcomes for you and your family and your loved ones, and find what can be even more than silver lining, in fact, blessing in the context of great suffering. In this story, I feel illustrates that very well. It doesn't deny Joseph's hardships, but
it took the series of the hardships to get us to this place. It took him being sold and then going into being used by Potiphar to take care of his place, and then being accused wrongfully and sent back to jail so he could be there for the cupbearer and the baker, so that the cupbearer could proclaim his abilities. I mean, they're all things that we would think of as hard, but they all needed to take place to have Joseph in the right place at the right time.
We don't know. It is what happened in the story. So it's hard to know if you rewound the script and if things had happened differently, if there had not been some other, if there's this underlying belief that God is always calling humanity and creation towards redemption, what other persons this story may have revolved around, if Egypt would have been saved from the famine, and if there might have, by extension, the grain would have been a blessing to other persons. There's really no way of knowing that. I guess
I think you can compare it with David's story. He's supposed to be king, but Saul doesn't let him, and then eventually he's gone, and then he messes up with Bathsheba and everything. But he always comes back to the Lord and praises the Lord. He recognizes his sin. And he wasn't the best father. He certainly didn't raise good sons, because he lost 4 of them. But it's life.
So going back to your original point, Sue, about looking at things and seeing that God's grace is there, or that you're moving through circumstances to the plan. I think that that's a really mature spiritual way of acceptance and seeing grace in all things. But when you're really hit with some tragedy, I know, just seeing patients or experiencing things myself, I hold on to those thoughts mentally, psychologically. I have those implanted in me, and somewhere deep there's a seed of that. But in that moment, if somebody comes up and says, "Oh, well, this is for the best," or you'll see the pattern eventually, or it's like, that's not what I want to hear.
No.
So it's like, it just takes time for these things to sort of, there's a process you kind of have to go through. And it's clear Joseph has had time to sit and let these things bloom. I mean, he's been apart from his family, not knowing if he'd ever see them again or if his father was alive. And it's probably taken years of faith and prayer and whatever else to come to these conclusions. And it's pretty remarkable, actually, the manifestation of his faith, I think, for him to say those things to his brothers, who he could have taken great vengeance against, but he did not. So I think that's a remarkable part of the story.
Yeah, I know it's hard. But I do think when situations arise in our lives, as they do for all of us, and instead of wondering why, you say, or ask God to help you through it. It's not if we really thought we were going to go through life without any difficulties, we're just wrong.
Oh yeah,
it's
sure.
not going to happen.
Sure.
I like what you just said there, Sue. I've said similar things to persons who are mourning the loss. There's one story that comes to mind, and I may have shared this before, and if I did, I'm sorry for repeating it. But there was a congregant I had whose daughter died on the surgery table. And this wasn't exactly expected. It was something like a risky surgery, but it had a reasonable chance for a positive outcome. But when I say died on the surgery table, I mean that she never woke up after. She spent maybe a month and a half alive after, but she never woke up from the surgery. And the woman looked at me at her funeral with this look in her eye that I would say was, I interpreted it to be a forced enthusiasm and joy, and said God needed another angel. That's why this happened. And I didn't touch that with a 10-foot pole at the time. This was what she needed to believe in that moment. But when she repeated it back to me a few months later, whilst her voice was cracking and she was on the edge of losing composure, that's where I said, I don't think the question of why your daughter died is something that we can even understand. She died because of our failed human biology and a complex network of reasons. The question for me is, what is God going to do? How is God's Spirit going to find us in this moment to hold us and to carry us through, and you and your family through? And that's where the shift between this why question, which wasn't very helpful to her in that moment. It was helpful to her when she thought that the answer, God needed an angel, was satisfying. When that stopped being satisfying, it stopped being helpful for her. And with Joseph in prison, you could just draw a parallel. He could have, and this is us inventing a part of the story, but you could easily imagine somebody in that circumstance saying, why me? But he seems to have done this. What now? I'll become the best manager of this prison that you can be, or I'll become the best servant this Potiphar has ever seen. We don't know. The Joseph we meet in this story always seems to have an answer and putting his next foot forward. But this story is supposed to have encompassed years, and we don't get those moments where a self-pitying why question, which is also very understandable too. If somebody is asking the question why, and right after somebody they love has died, again, I don't say, well, maybe you shouldn't be asking. I just, you just let.
Yeah. And from my own experience with losing loved ones, I just think, what would my life have been like without them? And God has provided a blessing for me by giving them to me. I may not have them now, but I had them at a time. Yeah. And I was blessed because I had them. So even though it's difficult, especially when it comes to a child. I have no idea the age of this child that you're talking about, but I know in one group I was in, there was a child that was 2 or 3 years old who went to be with the Lord. And I just kept thinking, if you had never had that child, you would not have had the joy that you had for those 2 or 3 years. And we just need to praise God for giving us those 2 or 3 years to have the joy. It's not easy. You gotta work through it. But if you can come to that place, then you can just give God the glory. And that's what we need to do, is to give him the glory.
I think I've seen it happen where the sorrow and the loss stays, but then people are also able to express gratitude in a similar way to what you just described.
Oh yeah.
One of the things that gets my dander up at a funeral is if to give you an example of the sort of thing that gets my dander up. And this is not what I think you're saying at all. I don't think this is what you're saying. I agree with what I think we're on the same page. But I one time sat through a funeral of a man who I love very much, who's very influential to me, and his entire family was sitting in the front row, including his teenage daughter, and they were all weeping. And the pastor, whose theology seems to have wanted to push the entire room to this place of I would describe as manic joy that we were not ready for.
Yeah.
Said the following line in front of his weeping teenage daughter: "We wouldn't ask for him back right now, even if we could, because he is in heaven and so much." And I'm thinking, I would. Right now, I would. Now, at the same time, I'm grateful for his life, his influence. I'm grateful for whatever the peace that he has found. Both are true. And there are some people who don't have a theology that allows for the pain and the suffering to do its work, to bring us to a greater appreciation. How much more grateful are we on the other side of pain and suffering? And it just shows how much depth and meaning that the life had, if it's a person that we're mourning the loss of, or if it's just like I'm getting to an age where I'm beginning to have lots of nostalgia and sense of loss of my younger years. And I know you all are rolling your eyes at me, 30 something years old that I am. But I'm at that age, and you probably remember that time in your life where you began to recognize that there were certain seasons of your life that are now past. And I think it is my missing those things, or the persons that I knew then, whether it's a life or memories that we're mourning the loss of. It just gives those things greater depth. And when I come to gratitude, the gratitude I feels far more. There's more to it when I feel it.
Yeah.
And
well, I can change the subject because there's one other thing that bothers me. I don't understand.
Okay.
Why did he, when he first recognized them, the first time they came, I realized he wanted to see Benjamin. I realized that. So he sent him back and said, "Bring me Benjamin." Okay. But why? Why didn't he just say, "I'm your brother. Bring me my brother. Bring me my father"? Because he knew then the father was alive. They told him that. And it's like he just keeps stretching it out, and making it harder and harder. I don't know. I think one thing that came up in the study was that he wanted to give them the opportunity to repent or whatever, but I think that was said the first time and everything. So I don't understand why he did this.
So like Janet's trying to
get myself unmuted.
There you are.
I mean, he was human. And I think I said at another time, he might still be trying to get a little revenge. I mean, after all, they didn't do him any favors. And he kind of stretched it out to me to kind of, well, I'll just put you through a little bit.
There are that's one possibility, and that's one that was named in the closing thoughts, where some commentator thinks that this is just way too much and entirely unfair and vindictive. I have toyed with a variety of possibilities, and they might all have their own legitimacy. They don't necessarily negate one another. The one is what you just said. The other is kind of, I'd say, the middle option, which is he doesn't know if he can trust them, and he's going to put them through a series of tests involving similar situations that he had been put through to see if they really have changed. Opportunities for them to bolt and leave a brother in Egypt, first a half brother, then a favored brother. Have they gotten over the favoritism that their father has shown? Are they still self-serving and wanting to, or are they going to, the kind that would bolt and leave Benjamin and make up a story when they get back home? So maybe he has questions of trust. The third really is the most flattering for Joseph. And it could be what we're supposed to think, because Joseph really comes off well after every story. I mean, he is the hero of the story who always seems to be playing three-dimensional chess with the entire situation. It could be that he very wisely and we are meant to think that he's very wisely and sagely putting his brothers through these experiences to bestow upon them the opportunities for repentance and the wisdom gained from the hardships. Those are all three, and those could all three be motives working in tension. Sometimes when I'm in an argument with my wife, I may actually be wanting to make a point. I may also be wanting to win. Both true. The motive to win is not a good motive. You need a better motive if you're going to be in an argument with anybody you care about. The motive to be understood is very understandable, and they could be both true. And sorting through the motives that are not necessarily in conflict, but perhaps, I could see by the time the story is we find in its final form, compiled by the redactors to be like this sort of seamless, nice story. My read on Joseph is that we are supposed to think that he is uniquely wise and discerning. So perhaps this long game he's playing with his brothers is deliberate by design and for the brothers' benefit all at once. Could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm having trouble. John's mowing the yard, and every time he goes by, the doorbell goes off, and it overrides the sound on the.
Well, we're not hearing it, so it's.
No, I know you're not hearing it, but because he's doing that, I can't hear you.
Oh.
So, but I get the gist. Yeah. So, yeah, I suppose I just I think of my own siblings, and I wouldn't. I just wouldn't treat them that way. Of course, I haven't been thrown into a pit either. So.
That's right.
Could you imagine?
Well, I'm not saying anything, but even with the circumstances that I have that are unique to one of my siblings and myself, I still would not do any kind of rejection of any kind. So it makes some sense.
You wouldn't put on some, what is it? Jack Rousseau is the Pink Panther guy, right? Is that right?
Rousseau.
Yeah, you wouldn't put on some sort of strange disguise and pretend to be someone else to lead them on for a few years and then drop the fake mustache and say, it was me, your sister, the whole time. And I forgive you.
It's I feel so often in family situations when there are difficulties, it's only because someone has misunderstood either an action or some words, and we all do that. We all, not just family, but friends and people we work with, and we say things that we're having a bad day and we're a little curt and probably we shouldn't have answered in the way we did. And we give the wrong impression, and so therefore now that individual you're having this communication with has a different opinion of you. And, we just need to be careful and understand where the other person's coming from and not hold it against them or anything.
If everyone came at our interfamilial disputes with that in that spirit,
Yeah, the world would be a different place.
That's right. That's right.
I just,
but I agree. That sounds like a good place to end. Thank you for our time together, and I'll meet you all next week. Well, you all take care, and I'll see you next week.
all right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.